not moving forward. I have to do it down here. Okay. Okay, I thought it would be helpful if I say just a couple of things about myself and the work that I do, really just to contextualize this talk. So I work on the justice of securitization, by which I mean I'm working very hard, trying very hard to develop moral principles that designate when securitization, by which I mean the use of emergency measures short of war, may be morally permissible. And I've written this all up in a book in 2019. And as you know, Mitya already mentioned, I'm sort of working on the follow-up to that as well. Now, in my work, I mean by securitization really this emergency measures thing, so the action, not the words. But many of you may be familiar with securitization for different reasons, which is this whole idea that the securitization is when something is rhetorically depicted as a security threat. You know, the whole idea of securitization is that there aren't actually any security threats out there, but something becomes a security threat because it is in language by relevant actors depicted as such, who seek with speaking security legitimation for emergency measures. So the emergency measures are part of it, but not necessarily. So all of this sort of raises the question, well, how can you write about the ethics of securitization, but not actually say very much about the ethics of speaking security? And before somebody else jumps in and does that, I've tried to do that in a paper published in the Review of International Studies in 2018. The paper is called Parallels with the Hate Speech Debate, the Pros and Cons of Criminalizing Harmful Securitizing Requests. And what I'm presenting here today is essentially a snapshot of that paper. Okay. So we all know, of course, that the terror attacks, in particular at 9/11, but also 7/7 and everything that followed subsequently, and I would say particularly also the counter-terrorism measures, or if you want to put it in language of securitization, the securitization of terrorism has led to a rise of anti-Muslim sentiment, but also a sort of anti-immigrant sentiment more generally. And this is often framed in very crass language, right? So you will have people saying very shocking things about immigrants or about Muslims. I've got a few examples here. This is the leader of Pegida, which is this Patriotic Europeans Against Islamization of the Occident, a group particularly prevalent in Germany, who in the wake of the refugee crisis in 2015 came up with this neologism, refuge ISIS, clearly, you know, to say, or to make it very clear that in his opinion, all refugees are somehow terrorists and affiliated with ISIS. Similarly, after the Cologne, I think that was New Year's Eve 2015, there were sort of various sexual assaults on women in the city center of Cologne. He coined the term rape-fugees to indicate, you know, all refugees are rapists. These are a little older. This is a newer example that I found. This was also from a Pegida rally, also this time not Bachmann, but someone else, who of course links the threat that Islam poses to the pandemic, and now speaks of Islamisierungsvirus. So the, you know, it's pretty self-evident, the virus that is Islamization. Now, all of these undoubtedly are incidents of Islamophobia, right? Now, Islamophobia is notoriously difficult to define. I went with the Runnymede Trust here, who define Islamophobia in 2017 as anti-Muslim racism, clearly sort of indicating a sort of element of hatred towards Muslims as part of Islamophobia. Now, the question that I ask in this article is, how should liberal democracies deal with public expressions of Islamophobia? And the obvious solution is to go for legal protections, criminalize them as part of hate speech. Quite a lot of countries have hate speech legislation already, although it doesn't necessarily include Islamophobia. But one example, again, you know, this is clearly because I grew up in Germany, I go back to the German example, an example from the German Criminal Code, where hate speech is formulated in law. But that's not the case everywhere. The United States, of course, is the sort of, I think, perhaps the paramount example of a country or a Western liberal democracy where you do not have any restrictions on freedom of speech, and where the same is very much resisted. So the question then is, or a second question I pose is, what if deeply hurtful and offensive and negative remarks are made not out of hatred for the other, so as the racism would suggest, but if they're actually made out of fear? I've sort of, I mean, I am admittedly out of touch with German public debate, right? I still sort of try and follow the newspapers a little bit, and it may be that I'm misrepresenting what the general public in Germany thinks, but one look at the Amazon sort of sales charts, there seems to be a whole industry of books that make this link between Islamization and fear for what's happening to this country that we live in. And I've got a few examples here. The bottom line here is wie der Islam unser Land bedroht, which means how Islam is threatening our country. Then here, Germany abolishes itself, how we are we're gambling our country away. And then here, the destabilization of Germany. So to me, that sort of indicates also an element of fear, certainly. You know, hatred might well be part of it, I'm not denying that, but certainly fear. So now I wonder if speech acts, such as the ones we've seen before, are actually made on the basis of fear rather than hatred. Does that change anything? So in the article, I introduce, of course, some sort of theoretical terminology, and I argue that perhaps we ought to understand these kinds of speech acts not as securitizing moves, which would be, you know, whereby a would-be securitizing actor seeks approval from a legitimizing or legitimating audience for whatever extreme action they will take subsequently. But what if it is instead a request, you know, which is to say, people that ask governments to deal with the threat? And when Professor Kasim earlier talked about Extinction Rebellion, I think that's actually quite a good example, because I think Extinction Rebellion do not seek legitimation for solving climate change themselves in extreme ways subsequently. They want to be heard, right? They want governments to act. They don't want to act themselves. They want governments to securitize climate change. And I wonder, going back to my example here, is what if offensive and unacceptable language is actually used to underscore the urgency? What if it's, you know, in a way required to bring your point across, because you will not be heard unless you put your grievances into this kind of extremist language? And then, of course, this raises a sort of question, if we are scared, should we not be allowed to actually voice this? And so then I go on to answer this question by looking at the case for and against legal restrictions. Sorry, I'm messing around with PowerPoint again. Or against offensive securitizing requests. And I do this, of course, not of my own back, but rather by looking at the very large hate speech debate that already exists mainly in philosophy. And I draw out some examples that are relevant. And so I will briefly lay out the case for, and then I will lay out the case against, and I will tell you why I think there ought not to be legal restrictions. Okay, so I have to do this very quickly because I'm conscious that time is short. So the first one obviously is the sort of what I call the insecuritization of Muslims and minorities, which is simply that if we tolerate and have such language, then we make these people feel insecure, and we ought to protect them. The second point is related to this. These kinds of speech acts, they erode well-ordered societies, which is a Rawlsian term, because society becomes more unjust. You know, we accept that certain people are excluded, and we do not protect them even from theoretical violence. But also they might actually spur hate crime. You know, some right-wing groups somewhere might think they actually ought to act on these, take the law into their own hands if the government isn't doing anything. And then conversely, they might lead to radicalisation and actually trigger retaliation. They might actually, even if there wasn't a problem previously, by creating these there's this term suspect communities, they might actually lead to some people feeling alienated and then retaliating against what they would then see as the view of general society, which of course in turn would render the population insecure. So very good reasons for actually doing this. So what could we hold against it? So let me explain the case against legal protections. The first one is, of course, that freedom of speech is a fundamental value of liberal democratic societies. You know, without it, we can't really say we live in a liberal democracy. And related to that, of course, is that government itself in a democracy is only legitimate if everyone has a voice. And there's this problem of a slippery slope. If you ban some expressions, would you then be inclined to ban others? What if you actually end up banning critique of government? You know, so those are fundamental points. Also, I think banning speech actually can cause further resentment. And it is generally better if arguments that the general public would disagree with are allowed to fail democratically. And here comes my last point, and this is actually the most important one that swings the scale in favor of the case against legal protection. This is the fact that securitizing requests, unlike securitization, do not actually cause any factual direct harm, but indirect harm only. So the speakers do not actually want to incite violence, unlike the hate speaker, but rather they want governments to securitize the issue. This means that the case against legal restrictions actually outweighs the case for restrictions, because legal protections against indirect harm are disproportionate. And here I have the same point again that I've already made, which is that if you look at existing, there's an S missing, hate speech legislation does not seek to punish the speaker for the expression, but for what they intend to do, what they aim at. And of course, here we have to remember, if it is true what I say, which may not be true, that these are securitizing requests, then the intention is simply that the issue is dealt with by government. So does this mean that it's okay to say what you want and how you want to. And there I then go into the next section of the paper and I say no, essentially, because there is such a thing as common decency, decorum, that there also is such a thing as responsibility, especially if you have what Bourdieu would call symbolic power, which requires you to request securitization in an ethical manner. And this pertains to two issues in particular: when to do it and how to do this. So as regards to when to request securitization. So when can you, as an ordinary individual walking around, require government or ask government to do something about the issue, including something extreme, to go back to some of the language we used earlier? And here I put, well, the first criterion ought to be when the available evidence suggests that there actually is a threat. Now, I know that some of you will disagree with the epistemological accessibility of whether or not threats are real. But I do not actually speak about threats or objectivity in the fact relative sense, but rather in the evidence relative sense, whereby you have to just have collected or amassed the evidence that suggests, you know, a threat is real. Secondly, I think you ought to request securitization only when securitization has a chance of improving the situation. Or, you know, would emergency measures actually make a bad situation worse? If you think about the example of immigration, for example, or terrorism, well, does it actually lead to greater radicalization? Does it lead to greater segregation in society, and so on? So you have to think, you ought to think a little bit at least about what may follow from this. Now we come to the how. My kids were very excited about me including this particular slide. And I don't include it to simply say, if you say some of the terrible or use some of the terrible and offensive terminology used by people like Bachmann, you're simply being rude. No, I use it to show that actually all societies have standards of how you behave towards one another, right? We don't exist in some sort of vacuum where we do not know how to communicate with other people and how to respect them. And how do I know this? Well, two reasons. First of all, we clearly are able to impart this to our children, including through books such as the Mr. Men, where we have Mr. Rude and Mr. Good, and many, many other books, of course, as well, that, you know, relay the same messages, but also because without explanation, each one of you will understand why a term such as, speaking of Islamization as a virus is rude and offensive and out of order. So we have those standards of behavior, and I think that's important in the terms of how to request securitization. Of course, there are some issues where we perhaps do not know how we should speak about them, what is allowed and what isn't allowed, but there will always be public debate that can decide in a way what the collective standard of communication on particular issues should be. And there's one other thing in terms of the how, which is this: just because you can say something, just because there aren't any legal restrictions on what you may say, it doesn't mean that you should say it in a particular way. And that, of course, goes in particular for powerful actors. I call, in the securitization theory, in the version that I developed, functional actors, the media most notably. So then the third point in terms of how to speak securitization or how to request security ethically would be to observe existing collective standards of communication, which actually may also be culturally specific, right? And in the interest of peace and security, exercise a degree of self-censorship. And that's it for me. This is our campus, where I haven't been in quite a long time. But anyway, thank you for watching and listening.
Thank you very much, Professor Floyd, for your presentation. The floor is open now for any questions. Laura?
Thanks for your talk, Rita. I was just wondering, I feel like it's quite optimistic, your account, and I'm wondering if sort of self-censorship is enough, particularly given how much of our information we're receiving online and how there is this avalanche of information coming at us that's reinforcing and perpetuating these awful stereotypes, such that it magnifies the level of harm being caused. And so, when I'm thinking about education, I do want to focus on what the individual can do and how we can be more critical and self-censoring, things like that. But I don't think that's enough. I think there needs to be sort of greater mechanisms of protection in place given the magnitude of the problem. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, this is a sort of Twitter banning Donald Trump kind of thing, isn't it? In part, that whether social media should act on those. Yeah, I haven't thought about it that too much, to be honest. I agree that to talk about self-censorship, that is optimistic, and of course many actors will deliberately not self-censor because they will have an agenda as well. They will want to achieve something, whether it is, I don't know, selling more newspapers, something as banal as that. Yes, but I think ultimately it probably is down to education rather than legislating. To actually educate people more about ways of behaving, perhaps including online. I mean, I have to say again, I think when you speak to very young people, I'll just have to talk about my children again. They're 10 and 6. They seem to know very well and intuitively how you behave, what is wrong and what is right in many ways, what is rude and what is not rude. But it seems to me that somewhere along the way, as you grow up, that gets lost. So there certainly is a role, and especially as you're online, you're anonymous, and you may say what a lot of people do bad things online. But there's still the question, should you ban it or shouldn't you ban it? And to me, it seems, it is this trade-off with democracy, isn't it? That seems so very difficult to bridge. So I think we ought to try with educating, but there are other mechanisms as well, naming and shaming, identifying the people that say offensive things and pointing out in public debate that what they say is unacceptable, that we do not stand for it as a general society, perhaps.
Yes, Vittorio, please go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to follow up on what you just said, because in answering Lara's question, it almost sounds like you're making a distinction between legislation and education. But legislation is a form of civic education. So that distinction sort of strikes me as a bit odd.
I mean, I hadn't thought about legislation like that before, I suppose, because of the element that it can be enforced, I guess. Yeah, I mean, I don't quite know how to respond to that, other than that I probably see it differently in terms of how, you know, where I would see yes, education as the sort of not voluntary realm, but the realm without coercive, where coercion doesn't follow if you do not do things in a particular way. But of course, there are ways of seeing it differently.